But as tradition for our congregation, our annual Labor Day service, and part of that tradition has been to draw from the text of the great labor anthem, Solidarity Forever, which Rock and Solidarity will sing at the end of our service. Our title recalls the final verse. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. When we consider that this song was written in 1915, its lyrics have stood the test of time in describing what we face today. Consider the second verse. Is there aught we hold in common with the greedy parasite, who would lash us into serfdom and would crush us with his might? Is there anything left to us but to organize and fight? Arguably, what we face may be even worse, because despite the cruel conditions faced by workers in 1915, no one back then predicted the risk of catastrophic human-created climate change. Nuclear weapons that could destroy most life on Earth had yet to be invented. The idea that humans could program technologies to make decisions independently of us would have seemed fantastical. Yet the song has an optimistic tone to it. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. Now, after 110 years of 2 steps forward for the labor movement, but often more steps back, it's fair to ask, is this true? In the face of existential threats to humanity as a whole, are we too late to answer Solidarity's call? To be bluntly honest, none of us truly know for sure. But with the renewed rise of overtly fascist rulers accelerating climate change and threats of nuclear war, do we really have any choice not to answer the call? Is there anything left to us but to organize and fight? Well, yes, there is a choice. We can give up or do nothing effective to stop our own destruction. And I assume that most of you agree, but I'm just not willing to settle for that. Now, at my age, I'm 70, I doubt I will live long enough to see any reversal. Besides, nothing is permanent or guaranteed. Yet I believe I and we owe it to future generations to keep trying. Nurtured in my youthful activism by labor veterans, some even old enough to have been alive in 1915, only 40 years before my birth, I was fortunate to learn about World War I conscientious objectors and the imprisonment of Eugene Debs, who gave that wonderful quote Mari read, the Ludlow Massacre and the Matewan Miners' War, the deportations of radical immigrant labor leaders in the 1920s, and of Mexican immigrants and their families, often US citizens, the exclusion of Asian workers, the crash of 1929, the unhoused internal migrants desperately seeking work during the poverty of the Great Depression, some which included members of my mother's family, the routine practice of lynching, the ongoing oppression of Jim Crow, the Black workers who went north and west for a better life, steadily breaking the color lines of organized labor. The general strikes that built the most massive labor efforts in US history in the late 1930s. The horrors of World War II, including the domestic incarceration of Japanese Americans. And the Red Scare that drove out militant labor leaders, albeit with pockets of surviving resistance like the West Coast longshore workers, the farm worker movement, and workers of color caucuses in auto and steel. By the time I became active in the labor movement in the mid-1970s, unions had plenty of members and money, but were only sporadically radical. By depending on and capitulating to the dead end of neoliberal electoral politics offered by the Democratic Party, labor lost its political independence, and thus its willingness to do whatever it would take to prevent what we are facing today. And union membership drastically declined. 50 years later, there is some renewed militancy, such as by teachers and social workers like Yahira. But as a whole, labor today still has yet to fully answer the call of solidarity. But tomorrow is Labor Day. Let's see how many turn out at all the demonstrations. I still think Debs was right. But there's no use waxing nostalgic about labor history. Unions, after all, are human, and like all human and social endeavors, we're never pure or perfect, even when militant. I still believe labor is the only force today that has the volunteer and financial power to shut down a fascist government. And with federal contacts broken, why is there so little talk about calling a general strike? But let's pivot a bit. With labor density at only 10% of US workers, that means a good proportion of the 90% who aren't organized need to pitch in too, if we are going to rise from the ashes of a new fascism, or more optimistically, to put out the fire of fascism before it reduces our world to ashes. Unions may have the unique power to shut down the economy and bring capitalism to its knees, but they are not the only means of organizing. What about your neighborhood, your schools, people who share your identities and interests? Fascism tests the waters by going after some groups first, but we are all in its sights. We do have common ground. Rising from the ashes means progressive faith communities need to reclaim public ground, asserting ourselves over and against political distortions of theology, such as Christian nationalism, or equating opposition to the genocide of the Palestinians with anti-Semitism, even while that opposition is voiced powerfully by growing numbers of Jews. Any version of religion that ignores the basic values almost all faiths claim to hold in common, such as loving your neighbor as yourself, welcoming the stranger, and providing for those in need, is complicit with rising authoritarianism. At a time when the absolute worst of religion is being promoted by our government, opposing such weaponized faith is not easy. We could lose our jobs, academic standing, physical safety, possibly our freedom or citizenship. It means all of us have to find ways to work across differences of race, gender, religion, age, geography, nationality, citizenship status, and the stratifications of class privilege, even to an extent across political ideologies. Now, we have all learned how hard that is, personally and organizationally. There are so many pitfalls. However, a possible silver lining in hard times is that people need each other more, and thus we have more incentive to work together for common liberation. Overcoming fascism means a pivot away from just lobbying for protective legislation or from electing spineless politicians beholden to their corporate donors, to creating our own social safety nets of mutual aid, separate from a government that is ripping apart an already very inadequate safety net. Faith communities in more affluent and liberal settings like ours may have to relearn how you do this. But mutual aid was and is now what allows many poorer and marginalized peoples to survive. Yes, we must continue to advocate for government that works for all of us. But meanwhile, we have to feed and house and protect each other from the existing government, a much harder set of tasks than what have often become ineffective and performative political rituals. We will need to develop our own leaders, not rely on those handpicked by our enemies to lure us with phony promises. It means getting more comfortable with ambiguous roles. On one hand, publicly organizing for mass mobilizations like the Labor Day marches tomorrow, but on the other, acting behind the scenes, sometimes clandestinely. To do that without increasing the risks to those more immediately impacted means following the lead of the most vulnerable and learning to accept a degree of hierarchy and collective discipline that many of us tend to resist. It means taking security seriously. Remember the old World War II slogan, "Loose lips sink ships"? Cell phones, social media, even GPS systems have great big lips. Whose ship do you risk sinking? And lastly, rising from the ashes means doing what we should have been doing all along, answering the call of the workers' solidarity, grounded in love and gratitude for the work that supports all of us. So if you are lucky enough to be in a union, get more active. Show up at meetings, volunteer for a committee, become a shop steward, organize your coworkers into activist caucuses, elect new officers if the old ones refuse to wake up. If you're not in a union, could you be? Find out. Who's on strike today? You could walk their picket line. What companies are committing the worst injustices and profiting the most from government collusion? Honor a boycott. Demonstrate against Tesla or Palantir, for example. And if you earn a living wage, tithe yourself to support groups that are organizing the resistance. But while you're at it, remember you're just one stone in the arch, as our earlier hymn said. You don't have to do it all. Yes, it's hard work, but it can be satisfying and even joyous. Think of it this way. None of us live forever, or even very long, but we still strive to enjoy ourselves, to fall in love, to find meaningful work, to pursue our talents and callings, and even take periodic vacations from all of the above, in spite of the reality of death, maybe even because of it. A life lived in service to liberation is no different. And I believe it's the most fulfilling life there is.